So for biology now, let's talk about cell reproduction. Let's remember our cell theory. So the first thing of our cell theory is that all living things are made up of cells. Our second point are that cells are the basic structural, biological, and functional unit of life. And lastly, the third point is that cells come from pre-existing cells. So this is what we're going to be looking at. So why do cells reproduce? Well, there's a number of reasons why they reproduce. The first reason is repair. So say you fell off your bike, you scraped your knees, you want to be able to replace those cells that were scraped off with other skin cells. All right, so we're going to be able to repair. If you break a bone, you want to be able to mend that broken bone with other bone cells. So for example, a scraped knee. All right, so we need to repair ourselves. The second reason cells reproduce is growth. Alrighty? We talked about cells being able to, or living things being able to grow both in the size of the cells and then in the number of cells. And if you think of yourself when you were just a little wee baby, you didn't have as many cells as you do now. So we've got growth from a baby into an adult. All right, as an example. So we've got fewer cells in a baby and a lot more cells in an adult, and those lots of cells have come from those cells reproducing themselves. Okay, and then the third one is reproduction. And if you remember back to our characteristics of life, we said that we had two types of reproduction. So we can either reproduce new cells, or we can produce a new organism. Alrighty, so something like a bacteria is going to need to reproduce, so one bacteria splits into two, where if we want to create a new organism like a baby, we're going to take two cells, combine them together to make one new organism. So again, I'm just going to quickly review this, the two types of sexual reproduction, or the two types of reproduction. Two types of reproduction. If we were in class, I'd say, can you remember the two types? First one was our sexual reproduction. So what happens here with our sexual reproduction is that the offspring has a combination of traits from two different parents. Alrighty, so we've got some information from mom and some information from dad that makes a new little cute baby. Alright, half the genetic information comes from one and half the genetic information comes from the other one. So the offspring have a combination of traits from two different parents. Alrighty, so in the terms of humans, half the genetic material comes from the female, half the genetic material comes from the male, and we're going to fuse those two together to form one cell, right? So we've got one cell now with a full set of genetic information. Now, when you get into grade 11, you're going to do this type of sexual reproduction in a lot more detail than what I'm doing with you right now. Alrighty? I'm going to move this sheet up a bit. So, the next type of reproduction is our asexual reproduction. Alright, in asexual reproduction, what we have is an offspring that has exactly the same traits as the parent cell. A lot of times we call it the mother cell, but I like to just say the parent cell because it's a little bit more inclusive. So the offspring here in asexual reproduction have exactly the same traits as the parent cell. right? So for example, if you take a clipping of a plant, all right, and it roots for you, that's a form of asexual reproduction. You're going to get a plant that is exactly the same as the parent plant. Okay, you don't get a plant that, I don't know, say you took a clipping of a strawberry plant and then you planted it and it came out to be raspberry. It just doesn't happen, all right? It comes out to be exactly the same. So in this case here, we've got one cell, right? And this cell has a full set of genetic information. So a full set of genetic material or information. Right? And it splits into two cells, right? And each of those cells have a full set of genetic information that is exactly the same as that parent cell. So we've got two cells that have a full set of genetic material, which is exactly the same as the parent cell. Okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about how all this happens, because it just doesn't magically happen like, boop, it pops into two. There's a whole process behind it. And that's going to be called the cell cycle. Alrighty, so get another, well, I have to get another page. So for the cell cycle, it's actually pretty cool. And again, this is one of those things you could spend your whole entire life studying the cell cycle. And it's really, really important. If you ever get into cancer research or anything like that, you'll really have to understand how the cell cycle works. And we're going to talk a little bit about cancer. I'm going to keep it for tomorrow because I find a lot of this stuff is quite overwhelming. If I bombard it, like for, we've been doing a lot of work in the last few days and I don't want to overwhelm your minds. So basically what happens is it's called a cycle because cells will sort of continuously do this. Now, if we're talking about something like a nerve cell in humans, nerve cells don't go through this cell cycle for the rest of their lives, but a lot of our cells do. Okay, so the cell cycle basically is, so cells reproduce. I would normally be doing this on the board with you guys, so I figured this was the best way to do this. Through a continuous cycle of growth and division. Okay, so that's what the cell cycle is. It's a continuous cycle of growth and division. All right, and we're going to have two stages. So we have two major stages here. Right? Really, really important. We have the growth phase. So like we said before, cells can grow in size and they can grow in number. So one of the important parts is that they have a growth phase. So during the growth phase of a cell, right, when we always say, oh, it's time when the cell's not dividing, it's just kind of relaxing. Well, it's not relaxing at all. It is so busy. It's metabolizing. So it's burning up glucose in order to form energy to do chemical processes. Metabolizing, sorry about that. All right, it's producing proteins. All right, it's doing respiration. All right, and it's actually physically growing. It's getting bigger. Alrighty, then all of a sudden the cell gets to a point where it's like, oh, it's time to divide. So if this was something like, say, a bacteria, it's once it gets to a certain size, it's too big for the nutrients to be able to get deep down into all the parts of the bacteria cell that it needs. So it splits itself so that it's a little bit smaller. Same thing with plant cells. Once they get too big and they can't get all the nutrients around, they split to be a little bit smaller and start growing again. So that's our first stage, is growth. And then 2 is when we have our division. Okay, and there's going to be 2 parts to this cell division. The first part is going to be what we call mitosis, and this is what we're going to get into. So mitosis is when the cell nucleus is dividing. Division of cell nucleus. All right, and the second part we have, it's called cytokinesis, and we'll talk a little bit about what these words mean when we get into a little bit more detail. So this is the division of the cytoplasm and the cell itself. Okay, that's an and there. Alrighty. So let me move this up a little bit. If we look at the cell cycle, if we can draw it as a sort of a little diagram. All right, so we'll just do a cell cycle. And cells are going to have different timings. The cells that live in your mouth, so the lining of your mouth, they live about 24 hours. So every time you're swallowing some of the dead cells that are sloughed off, but they're replaced constantly. Right? Bacteria, same thing. They can reproduce every 24 hours. Other cells are a lot slower. So it just depends on the type of cell that it is. So if we could draw the whole entire cell cycle as a circle, just do your best job you can. Okay, we're going to draw a cell around like this. Ugh. And then we're going to go like this. That was just terrible. Right? So basically what happens during this whole big long thing out here, let me try a different color, just make it look a little bit fancy. This is when the cell is growing. All right, this is when it's doing respiration, it's producing proteins, whatever it is. We call this phase, all right, I'm going to try to draw this fancy here, interphase. And we're going to get through and talk about all the phases coming up in a little bit. Right? So the cell spends most of its life in this growth phase, in this interphase phase. And then all of a sudden, for some reason, there's some type of trigger, and this is when we're going to have cell division. I'm going to try green on this one. So in this particular time right here, this is our cell division. All right? And in this particular case here, we're going to have these phases here. I'm just going to put the initials down for them, and we'll talk about them in more detail. So PMAT. And that stands for prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. And we're going to get into more detail about that in the next video. All right, and again, how long this takes, this whole cell cycle, depends on the type of cell. So the length of the cell cycle it varies from cell to cell. And it varies from organism to organism. Alrighty. Last little bit for this video. So before we get into all the phases, I just want to finish off the cell's life cycle here. So cell death. Dum dum dum. Sometimes cells, they just, well, not sometimes, but cells also die, all right? So they don't just keep dividing. Normal cells, I should say. Eventually, they're going to die. And we can have all sorts of different reasons why cells die. We can have a type of infection, all right? We can have poisoning of cells. Now, I'm talking about any type of cell, so plant, animal, bacteria, any type of cell. We can have overheating, which is one reason why we sterilize things at high temperature so that we overheat and kill bacteria. right? And we may have a drop in oxygen level, so we actually are smothering our either our own cells, or if you're like a bacteria, you suffocate. Cells of your heart die when you're having a heart attack because they don't have oxygen being delivered to them anymore. All right. Now, one of the other things that happens with cells is they have this thing that's called apoptosis. Alrighty, and this is a programmed death. So cells have a limited lifespan. Ready? So there's a difference between these two things. Like cells only live for so long, so they're not going to live forever and ever and ever. There comes a time where they just have to, move on. So what happens a lot of times with this type of death, all right, is the cells, they swell up, they pop open. It's really, really messy. Okay, so the cell swells up, bursts open. Okay, it's messy, and sometimes what happens when they break open and bust open, they can actually kill other cells. Now with this apoptosis, this programmed death, what happens here is the cell tends to shrink. All right, so the cell just kind of shrivels up on its own. It breaks up, so it's going to break up just nicely. It's just going to shrink down, break up, and then what ends up happening is other cells engulf it. So something like a white blood cell is going to come along, and it's going to engulf that dead cell, and then the parts of the dead cell can be recycled by the organism. So other cells engulf them. Right? And where we can see apoptosis is, for example, in a tadpole. So a tadpole has a tail, alrighty? And then at part of its life of development, those cells that are in that tail shrink up, all right? They're programmed death, they shrink up, they break up, they're resorbed, and the nutrients from the tadpole tail are used to form legs on the frog, all right? So that's a good example of apoptosis. Another example is a caterpillar. All right, so we got a caterpillar, goes into its little pupae and then into the cocoon, and then what ends up happening with it is it forms a butterfly. So some of those caterpillar parts, those cells in the caterpillar, are used to form wings of the butterfly. Right, so that's nice programmed death. Alrighty, so I believe that is what we have for this video. There's going to be another one that comes up that talks about the stages of mitosis, so be ready for that one.